He came alone, long before the speeches, in a uniform older than most of the crowd. An elderly veteran, cane in one hand and an old phone in the other, stopped cold at a locked cemetery gate. Security told him to leave. Rules were rules, Memorial Day or not. But behind those bars lay a single promise made in war and kept for 55 years. What happened next wasn't loud or planned. One quiet phone call, a gate swung open, and an entire crowd witnessed a moment that rewrote more than policy. A man refused to let memory be locked out, and changed everyone watching. The morning was quiet, too quiet for Memorial Day. No speeches yet, no bugle, no fluttering rows of flags or families laying wreaths. Just a locked gate, a length of black iron laced with fresh ivy, and a man in a crisp dress uniform standing on the outside looking in. The brass on his chest caught what little sun the grey clouds allowed, but nothing else about him tried to shine. He wasn't there to be seen. He was there because today was the day, and he was never late. Sergeant First Class William Gaines, retired, stood with the calm posture of someone who had made and kept harder appointments. His uniform was pressed flat, his medals, 7 across, 2 down, worn not as decoration but as memory-made metal. A folded cap sat on his head just so, not tilted for style but aligned, as if it still mattered that the cover be straight. One hand rested on the curved handle of his cane. The other held an old flip phone, scuffed but charged. At 7:05 a.m. the security cart rolled up with a soft crunch of gravel. The young man driving it, barely 30, wore a windbreaker with the cemetery's logo and mirrored sunglasses that made him look vaguely official but somehow bored. He slowed when he saw the man at the gate and let out a small breath before stepping out. "Sir?" he said carefully, not impolite but rehearsed. "The cemetery doesn't open to the public until 10. William didn't answer. Not at first. He simply looked past the young man, through the bars, down the curved drive that dipped into the sea of white marble. Then his eyes stopped. 3rd row from the front, 5th marker in. His cane tapped once on the sidewalk, and he shifted his weight slightly. The young guard repeated himself. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to come back later. We're still preparing for the ceremonies. Staff only till 10. William turned his head slowly and studied the guard, as if memorizing the face. Not with anger, but with the stillness of someone who didn't rush decisions. Then he spoke, voice low but clear. "I'll wait," the guard shifted. "I mean, you can't loiter right here, sir. We've got vehicles coming in and—" "I'm not loitering," the veteran replied. "I'm remembering." The tone didn't invite argument. It wasn't sharp, just rooted in something older than policy. He returned his gaze to the headstone and said nothing more. The security guard walked back to his cart, hesitated, then keyed his radio. "Dispatch, I've got an individual outside Gate B. Elderly male, uniform, full medals. Says he's waiting." A static, crackled voice responded. "Tell him we open at 10. No exceptions." The guard looked back over his shoulder. William hadn't moved. The cane still planted firm, the shoes polished but dusty from the sidewalk, the left knee slightly bent, an old injury perhaps. He stood like men do at attention when no one's watching. The grave he watched had no visible name from this angle, just the flat gleam of a marble slab, newly cleaned for the holiday. But to William, it was the only reason he'd gotten up this morning. The only reason he still ironed his pants the night before, laid his tie straight, and ran a hand over a photograph in a frame before leaving the house. By 7:13, the air had shifted slightly, not with wind but with awareness. Groundskeepers paused their hedge trimming near the far side. A staff photographer, arriving early to capture shots for the local newspaper, lowered her camera as she approached the front gate and caught sight of him. She didn't lift it again. Not yet. At 7:15, William opened the flip phone. No contacts, no apps. Just a number he remembered. He pressed the green button and held it to his ear, his eyes never leaving the headstone. The call connected. This wasn't the first time he'd been told no, but it might be the last time he'd need to ask. The air around the gate seemed to thicken as the minutes passed. The cemetery still looked like a painting under a muted sky. Rows of white headstones lined with perfect precision. damp grass glinting with dew, and a single black iron fence between a man and the promise he had carried for more than half a century. William Gaines stood as though the chill meant nothing, his back straight despite the cane, the ribbons on his chest unmoved by the soft wind. From the outside, he looked like a statue of discipline placed at the entrance to guard what lay within. But inside, his mind was already at the grave, at the conversation he had rehearsed silently for a year. The security guard had returned to his cart but didn't drive off. He sat behind the wheel, tapping his thumb against the steering column and glancing over at William every few seconds. His mirrored sunglasses couldn't hide the small crease forming between his brows. He wasn't a bad man. He wasn't even trying to be rude. But he had a laminated sheet of rules and an earpiece crackling with instructions. No entry until 10, it had said, and he'd been hired to follow it. Orders are orders, he'd been told during his training week. A policy doesn't bend just because someone shows up in a uniform. At 7:25, the guard got out again. This time, he didn't walk up directly, but stopped a few feet away like someone approaching a wild animal, respectful but cautious. "Sir," he said softer now, "I know you've been waiting, but I really do need you to step back from the gate. We've got maintenance vehicles coming through at 9. I'm not trying to disrespect you." William shifted his eyes from the grave to the guard without moving his head. "Do you know who's buried there?" His voice was low, steady. The guard blinked. "No, sir. I just started here 2 months ago." "Corporal Alan Reed," William said, pronouncing the name as though it were a command to stand at attention. "Killed in Quang Tri Province, Vietnam. March 8, 1969. He was 20. He was my friend." The guard's mouth opened slightly, but he didn't speak. William turned back to the headstone. "I told him I'd be here," he continued. "Every year, as long as I'm alive. That's why I'm at this gate. I'm not a tourist. I'm not early. I'm on time." The words hung in the air like frost. For the first time since his shift began, the guard took off his sunglasses. His eyes were young, uncertain. He looked at the uniform again, the medals, the perfectly folded cap. Something in him wanted to step aside, to let the man through. But the radio on his belt hissed again. "Security check gate B situation." The voice barked. He lifted it to his mouth. All clear," he said finally, voice trailing off. William didn't move. He had spent a lifetime waiting in worse places for longer stretches, holding ground while someone else decided what came next. He knew the power of stillness. He had learned it in jungles where movement meant death, in hospitals where hours stretched into days, in decades of annual pilgrimages to the same plot of land. He wasn't defying the guard. He wasn't even angry. He was simply present, like a sentry at his post. A breeze picked up, rattling the ivy against the gate. The guard stepped closer now, drawn despite himself. "Sir," he said quietly, "even if I wanted to let you in, the keys are in the office. My supervisor has them." "I'm sorry." William glanced at his phone again, thumb hovering over the keypad. "I understand," he said. "Sometimes a man just needs to make a call." He flipped the phone open, pressed a button, and raised it to his ear. His face remained expressionless, but his shoulders straightened slightly, as if he were back on parade ground awaiting a commander's order. The guard took a half-step back, watching. On the other side of the fence, the marble markers waited in their silent rows, and beyond them a single headstone, with a name that only William seemed to see, glowed faintly in the morning light. Like a point on a map he had always known how to reach. Inside the gate, the cemetery sloped gently downward like a green sea, each headstone rising like a small white sail. To the left, rows of flags waited furled for the morning ceremony. To the right, a maintenance truck hummed softly while its crew strung bunting along a low wall. None of it mattered to William. His gaze was fixed on a single marker in the third row, fifth from the front, where marble met memory. He could almost trace the name with his eyes alone, the way a blind man reads by touch. He didn't need to see it to know it. Corporal Alan Reed. He had been 19 when he signed up, 20 when he died. Ohio farm boy, quick with a joke, eyes like a clear autumn sky. They had met on the bus to basic training in 1967, Two strangers with duffel bags and accents so alike they could have been cousins. By the end of that first week, they were sharing cigarettes behind the barracks and swapping stories of high school football and cheap cars. By the time their orders sent them to Vietnam, they were brothers without needing to say the word. William's hand tightened slightly on his cane. In his mind, the iron gate was no longer a barrier, but the lip of a rice paddy, the air heavy with humidity and insects, the sound of rotors somewhere far off. He could still see Alan crouched beside him in the mud, scribbling a letter to a girl named Emily, back home, the paper damp from sweat. "If I go first," Alan had said, only half joking, "don't you dare let them forget me. You better be there when they carve my name in stone." William had grinned. "If I go first, you better salute." They'd shaken on it like kids making a pact behind the school. The memory shifted. March 8th, 1969, Quang Tri Province. An ambush on a supply convoy. William had been riding in the third truck when the lead vehicle exploded. Alan had been in the second. The next few minutes were a blur of gunfire, shouting and smoke. William had scrambled toward the burning wreck, pulling two men out before machine gun rounds chewed up the mud around him. He remembered Alan's face through the haze, blood on his helmet, one hand reaching. Then a medic's voice, "We have to move." William had been dragged back. The chopper lifted off with Alan on the stretcher. It was the last time he saw him alive. Now, 55 years later, the cane under his palm felt like the weight of that day. Every Memorial Day since 1970, he had come to this grave, rain or shine, uniform pressed, salute ready. He had watched the seasons change, the grass grow over and be cut back, the marble weather from bright to dull and back to bright again. He had kept his promise without fail, except for the 2 years the pandemic had closed the gates. That absence had burned. This visit was more than a ritual. It was a repair. Beyond the bars, a groundskeeper in coveralls walked past the headstone with a bucket of water and a brush. He stooped, scrubbed the marble briefly, and moved on. The stone gleamed whiter for a moment in the grey morning, and William's heart caught. He could almost imagine Alan standing there, smirking at the fuss. "You're late, Sarge," he'd tease. William would answer, "Traffic," and they'd both laugh, but there was no laughter now. Only a locked gate, a young guard shifting from foot to foot, and an old soldier staring through iron at a single point of earth. The smell of cut grass mixed with the faint scent of oil from the maintenance truck. A crow called once from a pine tree and then fell silent. William drew a slow breath. His thumb brushed the phone in his other hand. He was not a man to raise his voice or beg. He had learned in war that timing and composure were weapons too. But every minute that passed before he reached that grave felt like a failure of the vow he had made. He straightened his shoulders, eyes locked on Alan's name, and murmured under his breath, "I'm here, buddy. I'm not leaving. Just give me a minute." On the far side of the fence, the headstone waited, patient and white against the dark grass. The cemetery blurred in front of William until it became another landscape altogether. The iron fence's vertical bars turned into the straight shafts of palm trees, the trimmed lawn into swampy ground, the cool May air into a heavy, wet heat full of insects and gun oil. It was always like this when he stood too long staring at Alan's stone. The past did not just return. It arrived whole with sound and smell and weight. He let it come because it was part of why he was here. He saw again the day they stepped off the transport at Da Nang, boots sinking into the red dust. Alan had grinned even then, helmet cocked back on his head, and said, "Well, Gaines, at least it's warm." They were both 20-something and full of a half-earned bravado. Clutching rifles they had only fired on training ranges, looking at each other to make sense of the noise and motion of a war already older than they were. The first weeks were a blur of sweat, patrols, and learning how to move without thinking. Alan had been the one who started the running joke about promises. "If you go first," every time a mortar whistled overhead or a convoy ran late. It was how they kept fear at bay. There was a night patrol in late November of 1968 when they nearly didn't come back. They had been walking a low trail along a tree line when flares lit the sky, and everything went to chaos. William remembered the crack of AK-47 fire, the way Alan shoved him down and fired back before pulling him into a ditch. They'd spent 3 hours in mud that smelled of iron and rot, trading fire with an enemy they could not see. When the sun came up, they were both alive, but something had shifted between them. They stopped being 2 young men from Ohio and became 2 halves of a survival pact. In that memory William still carried, Alan's voice was always the same, steady, slightly teasing, always breaking tension with a joke. "If you get out before me, you better stand tall at my funeral," he had said once, sitting on an ammo crate, writing a letter to the girl back home. "I want a proper salute. None of that casual stuff." William had rolled his eyes. "If you outlive me, you better show up with a case of beer." They had shaken hands on it, sealing it like a childhood dare. March 8th, 1969 had been the day the joke ended. Their convoy had rolled into Quangtri province under a low grey sky. William had been 3 vehicles back when the lead truck erupted, a column of fire and shrapnel. He remembered Alan climbing out of the second truck, shouting orders, waving men forward even as small arms fire erupted from the tree line. William had tried to reach him, but a blast knocked him flat. He crawled through mud and debris until a medic pulled him back, shouting that they had to move. The chopper lifted off with Alan on the stretcher, one hand raised weakly, and disappeared into the sky. That image had followed William home like a ghost. The telegram had arrived before he could even unpack. "Killed of wounds sustained in action March 9th, age 20. No details, just a folded flag and a grave that appeared a month later back in Ohio. He came every year because that promise was the only thing he had left of his friend. He pressed his thumb harder on the cane now, grounding himself in the present. The cemetery came back into focus. The iron gate, the dew on the grass, the young guard leaning against his cart, pretending not to watch. William's uniform felt heavy on his shoulders, but right, like armor he had put back on for a final mission. He shifted his stance, eyes locked on the marble stone that bore Alan's name. "I'm still here," he murmured under his breath. "I kept it." The wind moved through the trees like a whisper. In his mind, boots crunched red dust again, and a young man laughed just out of sight. The cane tapped once, twice, like a metronome keeping time with memory. William adjusted his cap and kept staring through the bars. Already halfway back in the jungle, and halfway here at the gate, refusing to step away until the past and present lined up again at the same piece of earth. The cemetery's quiet was now punctuated by the sound of policy, radios crackling, carts moving, clipboards snapping shut. A second security employee had arrived, this one older, carrying a thermos and a binder. He came to stand beside the younger guard, glancing at William through the bars as if to size up a problem he'd rather not have. They conferred in low voices, pointing once at their laminated Memorial Day procedures sheet, once at the veteran in dress uniform. The scene had the feel of a checkpoint rather than a cemetery gate. 2 men with authority, 1 man with purpose, a fence between them and a field of white stones beyond. William stood immobile. His cane planted on the pavement looked like it had roots. The medals on his chest caught the faint sun as clouds shifted overhead. He didn't look at the men. He kept his gaze on the grave. His stillness was not passive. It was deliberate, the kind of patience that comes from years of waiting under orders, waiting for pickup zones, waiting for medics, waiting for a name to be called on a list. He had learned that sometimes you hold your ground and let the other side exhaust itself first. The older security guard cleared his throat and tried a different tack. "Sir," he called, voice not unkind but edged with officialdom, "we can't allow visitors before 10. Ceremonies are being set up, equipment moving around. Insurance doesn't cover public access yet. We're just doing our job." He held up the binder like it was a shield. "If we bend it for one, we bend it for all. I'm sure you understand." William finally turned his head, just enough to meet the man's eyes. "All," he repeated softly. "Is that what you call him?" He inclined his head toward the gravestone. "All?" The question wasn't hostile. It was precise, a scalpel rather than a hammer. The older guard shifted his weight. The younger one looked down at his shoes. "You're a veteran?" The older man asked after a pause. "I am," William said. "And the man buried there was my friend. I've come every year since they put him in the ground. I'm not asking for favors. I'm keeping a promise." The guards exchanged glances. The radio on the older man's belt squawked again, someone asking for an update on the situation at Gate B. He thumbed the button. "Under control," he said. Though his tone lacked conviction, William lowered his gaze back to the grave. The cemetery around it looked like a field of small white sentinels, each stone a story cut off. He thought of how many other men stood outside fences like this one, locked out of their own memories by policies drawn up on paper far from mud, blood, or jungle. He straightened slightly, shifting his cane to his left hand. His right hand opened the flip phone. The sound of it clicking into place was almost like the snap of a rifle's bolt. The guards noticed. "Sir," the younger one began, but William had already pressed the green button. He lifted the phone to his ear, still facing the grave. His voice was steady, low enough that only snatches carried across the gate. "This is Sergeant First Class William Gaines, retired. I need you to confirm something." The guards went silent. The older one stepped closer, drawn despite himself. "Who's he calling?" He muttered under his breath. William's shoulders squared. Decades of parade grounds and field orders came back to him like muscle memory. This was not a plea. This was a transmission. He listened for the reply, eyes never leaving the headstone. The gate, the guards, the binder, the laminated rules, all of it faded behind the focus of a man who had spent his life making sure the right message reached the right person at the right time. Inside the cemetery, a gust of wind moved through the rows, lifting the flags in a brief ripple, as if the stones themselves had shifted in silent expectation. William closed his eyes once, the phone at his ear, and spoke again. Just a few words, but they landed like a command. The younger guard swallowed hard, sensing that something was about to change. Though he couldn't have said why, the call was still ringing when William opened his eyes and said quietly, "Sometimes the line to a grave runs further than a fence." It was the kind of call that didn't need to be placed often. Not in a civilian world, at least. But William Gaines had never really stopped thinking in terms of command and protocol. His thumb pressed the green button with the familiarity of someone who still understood chain of command. Not a hesitation, not a doubt. He'd memorized the number long ago, had dialed it once before, years earlier, after a friend's flag burial had been mishandled. The voice that picked up then had been swift, sharp, and decisive. He was counting on that voice again now. The line rang once, then twice. Then came a click, not abrupt but deliberate. A pause. Then, "Colonel McBride." William's voice lowered but sharpened, the kind of tone that carried authority even when spoken softly. "Colonel, this is Sergeant First Class William Gaines. Retired." There was no hesitation on her end, just a brief intake of breath. "Sergeant Gaines, of course. What can I do for you?" The guards outside the gate couldn't hear the conversation clearly. They only saw the veteran standing straighter now, his bearing shifting from weary to formal. His left hand tightened on the cane, but his right remained steady as the old phone rested against his ear. The young guard leaned in slightly, curious now, not just about who was on the other end, but why this man suddenly radiated the calm tension of someone who had just entered a different kind of battlefield. "I'm at Maple Ridge Veteran Cemetery," William said. "Gate B, I'm being told I can't enter until 10 o'clock. A pause. "Then, that's their Memorial Day procedure?" "That's what they say," he replied. "But I'm not here to attend a speech. I'm not here to watch flags go up. I'm here to fulfill a promise. There's a man in Section 3, Row 5, 5th stone in. Corporal Alan Reed, KIA, Quang Tri, March of '69. Colonel McBride was silent for a moment. Then came a soft exhale that could have been respect. "You go every year?" "Every year," William said. "Except when the pandemic kept the gates locked. This is the first year I've had to ask permission." Another moment of quiet. Then McBride's voice changed, cooling, shifting into the clipped tone of military coordination. Who's the site coordinator today? I don't know. Two guards. One's young. One's got a clipboard and thinks paper outweighs memory. I'll handle it, she said. Give me 15 minutes. William didn't thank her. He didn't have to. Their exchange wasn't sentimental. It was procedural, efficient. But inside it, between the few spare words, lay a deep current of mutual understanding. She knew what this meant. She knew what kind of man would call, not to complain, but to ensure the correct respect was rendered to the fallen. I'll be waiting, William said, and ended the call without flourish. The phone clicked shut like the slide of a sidearm returning home. The guards shifted again. The older one raised an eyebrow. That sounded official. William didn't reply. He tucked the phone into his jacket pocket and returned his gaze to the grave. The younger guard spoke quietly. Sir, can I ask who you called? You'll see soon enough, William said without looking. You may want to keep the gate unlocked. Neither man replied, but both stood straighter. 8 minutes passed, then 10. At 12 minutes past the hour, the sound of tires on gravel broke the morning hush. Not the low hum of maintenance carts or staff sedans. This was different, heavier, more deliberate. Two black government SUVs, their headlights still on, rolled slowly to a stop just outside the fence. The younger guard swallowed. The older one lowered his binder. William didn't move, but his lips pressed into a thin line. Not of triumph, of duty fulfilled. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't demanded anything. He had made a phone call. Because sometimes all it takes to open a gate is to remind the world who kept it standing in the first place. The first SUV door opened with a slow, deliberate motion. No flashing lights, no sirens. Just the quiet authority of an engine going still and the sound of polished leather boots touching pavement. The driver, a sharply dressed non-commissioned officer in army dress blues, stepped out and surveyed the entrance with a glance that measured everything. Positions, posture, weather, tone. Then, without fanfare, he walked around to the rear passenger door and opened it. From the vehicle emerged a tall woman in full service uniform. Her hat squared perfectly, medals aligned with mathematical precision. Boots that didn't need shine because they never lost it. Her nameplate read McBride. She didn't pause to assess the situation. She didn't speak to the guards. She walked directly to William Gaines. Sergeant First Class, she said, saluting first. William returned the salute without hesitation, his cane tucked to his side. It wasn't crisp, but it was complete. Colonel, he said, giving the name its proper gravity. They stood facing one another, two generations of service joined not by rank or ceremony, but by understanding. She had read the files. She had seen the name Alan Reed before. It wasn't just another veteran's grave to her. It was a ledger entry in the long record of military debt, one that Sergeant Gaines had personally carried for 55 years. She knew that weight. She had carried some herself. Without turning her head, McBride addressed the guards, who now stood as if fused in place. This man is here under direct authorization, she said, her voice level, not raised, but the kind that left no room for doubt. He will be given full access, effective immediately. The older guard cleared his throat. Colonel, our policy has been overridden, she said, still not looking at him. This is not a disruption. This is a continuation of duty. The guard took a step back, lips pressed tight. The younger one just nodded, suddenly aware that today was not about procedures. It was about presence. Colonel McBride turned back to William. You walked in the jungle for him. The least we can do is walk you to his grave. He hesitated, then nodded once. Appreciated, ma'am. She turned to her staff sergeant and said, Escort him. Then she stepped aside, not out of deference, but out of respect. The staff sergeant offered his arm, but William waved it off gently. I can walk. He adjusted his cap, shifted his cane, and moved toward the gate. It creaked open, not from age, but as if the metal itself recognized who now passed through. As William stepped over the threshold, the weight in his chest shifted. He wasn't in the jungle. He wasn't in a waiting room or a parade ground. He was walking, as he had sworn he would, to the final resting place of the man who had once said, You better show up. Colonel McBride followed 2 paces behind, her presence silent but steady. The cemetery stretched out before them, gleaming under the grey morning sky. The wind had calmed, as if it too was watching. The headstone, 3rd row, 5th marker, seemed to brighten as they approached, not from light but from recognition. Behind the gate, the 2 guards remained still, not because they were ordered, but because they now understood they were witnesses to something they hadn't been trained for, the unbroken fulfillment of a soldier's word. William stopped 10 paces from the grave. He did not speak. He did not cry. He simply exhaled, long, deep, and final. The call had been made. The gate had opened, but it was never about the phone. It was about the man buried in row 5, and the man who never let him be forgotten. Colonel McBride remained silent as William moved forward, his cane tapping steadily against the path like a timekeeper in a long-forgotten march. She didn't issue further instructions, didn't wave anyone over, didn't ask for documentation or protocol to be followed. She had given one order already, and it had been enough. Now her role was no longer that of commanding officer. It was something quieter, something reverent. Behind them, the cemetery grounds had fallen still. Even the maintenance crew that had been arranging flags along the walkway had paused. One of the young groundskeepers, a boy barely in his 20s, held a folded American flag under one arm and watched the scene unfold with the wide-eyed stillness of someone realizing he was witnessing history, not ceremony. The staff sergeant who had accompanied Colonel McBride took position a respectful distance behind William, but made no move to hurry him. The gate had closed softly behind them, but no one locked it again. Even the clipboard with the rules, the one that had, moments earlier, seemed more solid than stone, was now tucked awkwardly beneath the older guard's arm. As if he no longer wanted to be seen holding it, William reached the edge of the 3rd row. He didn't need to count the markers. He had walked this line for decades. He knew the rhythm of each name passed along the way, the tilt of the soil beneath his shoes, the subtle angle at which Alan's grave sat beneath a leaning elm tree that, over the years, had grown just enough to shade it fully by noon. He stopped. The cane held still, his body squared to the headstone. Alan's name stood there in bold capital letters, freshly cleaned, just as it always was this time of year. Corporal Alan J. Reed, United States Army, Kia, March 8, 1969, Quang Tri Province. Vietnam beloved son, faithful friend, never forgotten. William removed his cap. A breeze moved through the tree branches overhead. Not enough to stir leaves, but enough to shift the ribbon on one of the nearby wreaths. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was thick with meaning. No one spoke. Even the wind seemed to wait. Then William stepped forward, close enough to read the finer carving in the stone, the one line he had arranged personally back in 1970, when Alan's parents could not bring themselves to choose. If I go first, you better not forget. William had kept that line alive with every visit. He brought his feet together slowly. Despite the years, despite the pain in his right leg and the ache in his back, he stood tall. Then, without wavering, he raised his right hand in a slow, perfect salute. The kind that isn't meant to impress. The kind that's meant to speak. No cameras, no reporters. Just a man and a grave, and a promise that hadn't rusted with time. Colonel McBride lowered her eyes. The staff sergeant behind them did the same, and on the hill near the maintenance shed, one of the young groundskeepers slowly came to attention without being told. William held the salute for several seconds, longer than regulation required. Then he lowered his arm, not with fatigue but with dignity. He bent slightly, reaching into his coat pocket. From it he pulled a single piece of folded paper. The edges were worn, the ink faded in places. He crouched, just barely, enough to tuck it beneath a small, flat stone at the base of the marker. He didn't read it aloud. It wasn't meant for anyone else. Then, with a deep breath, he rose. He turned and gave Colonel McBride a small nod. She returned it without a word. The escort was over. The order had been given, but more importantly, it had been understood. As William turned away from the grave, The air felt heavier than before, not with weather. The clouds still drifted lightly overhead, and the sun had begun to thread weak rays between the branches. But with memory, with time, with the pressure of what wasn't said but always felt, Colonel McBride remained beside him, silent. She didn't need to ask why this year was different. She already knew. She had read the letter that came months ago, handwritten on lined paper in a steady but aging script. It wasn't a request. It was a statement of intention, and buried within it was something only a soldier would catch: urgency. William walked slowly back toward the path, not out of reluctance but out of reverence. Every step away from the headstone was taken with the quiet calculation of someone who knows the number of visits left may be fewer than the ones already given. That was the truth, unspoken but known. His steps were just slightly shorter this year, the breath a little slower, and the silence even heavier, because this wasn't just a return. It was a resumption after an interruption that had nearly broken the promise. For 2 years, the gates had been closed, not permanently, but effectively. The pandemic had locked down public spaces, and Maple Ridge had been no exception. Memorial Day ceremonies were cancelled. Visitors were turned away. Even family couldn't enter without pre-clearance, and exceptions were rare. William had tried. He had written, called, waited. But policy stood tall that year, and he had not pushed harder than was dignified. Instead, he stood outside the gate on that Memorial Day morning in 2020, alone in full uniform, medals catching the wind, with no one but a passing jogger to witness it. He had saluted from the sidewalk, unable to see Alan's name from that distance, but knowing exactly where it lay, in the rows. He had whispered the same words, "Still here, buddy?" But it hadn't felt complete. The following year had been worse. Restrictions remained, but so did his age. A fall on the porch steps in April had taken weeks to recover from, and by May, his doctor told him plainly, "You won't make it down the hill, Sergeant." Not this year. William didn't argue. He didn't explain. He simply folded the letter he had written to Alan, sealed it, and placed it on the mantel under his friend's photograph. But this year, he was well enough to walk. The hill didn't look any shorter, the cane no lighter, but his will had outpaced both. That's why he had come earlier than permitted. That's why he had stood unmoving at the gate. Because a gap had opened in his ledger, 2 years without a salute, and that debt had gnawed at him daily. Colonel McBride, walking 2 steps behind now, could feel it. She'd seen it before, not in policy briefs or combat reports, but in letters she'd received from old men across the country, those who carried one name heavier than the rest, those who believed that showing up wasn't a gesture, it was a mission. Ahead, the younger security guard remained near the open gate, his stance stiffer now, his hat removed, held at his chest. He hadn't said another word since the SUVs arrived, but something in his posture had changed. The kind of change that doesn't come from reprimand or embarrassment. The kind that comes from understanding, sudden and humbling. William reached the threshold again and paused. He didn't turn back to look at the grave. He didn't need to. He had memorized its lines long ago, but he did let his hand drift toward his breast pocket. Inside, next to his folded phone, was a tiny photograph. Faded, yes, torn at the corners. But in it, 2 young men in jungle fatigue stood shoulder to shoulder, grinning through the sweat and grime. He didn't pull it out. He just touched it gently. This year mattered because it was a repair. Because silence had stretched too long. Because a promise doesn't expire when policies change or gates close. It waits, and when it's time again, it rises. Even if that means arriving early, cane in hand, medal ribbons stiff in the morning air, and waiting patiently until someone answers the call. By 8:20 a.m., the cemetery grounds had changed. Not in appearance. There were still folding chairs being arranged in rows under a white canvas tent. Still flags waiting to be raised. Still brass instruments warming up near the main memorial circle. But in atmosphere, something quiet had settled in. Not grief, not reverence, something deeper. Something closer to acknowledgement. The guards no longer hovered near the gate. The older one had stepped back, clipboard forgotten, leaning against the post, like a man reconsidering more than just a morning's procedure. The younger one, hat still clutched in his hands, watched William Gaines, not with suspicion now, but with the puzzled expression of someone watching an unfamiliar ceremony. They suddenly realize they should have known all along. And William. William had returned to the base of the elm tree, standing once again before the grave. He had not moved much. He had no need. The mission was not to do anything. It was simply to be there, to stand in the place where memory met presence. He didn't check the time. He didn't check his phone. He didn't even sit on the bench nearby. His cane stood rooted like a staff. He remained on watch. The staff sergeant from Colonel McBride's escort remained nearby, hands behind his back. He had asked no questions, only nodded once when William returned to the headstone after their first walk. McBride herself had made a quiet exit shortly after, as she always did in moments like this, when authority had fulfilled its duty, and what remained was sacred and personal, and not meant for military oversight. At 8:40, a woman in a red sweater approached the gate, holding the hand of a small boy. She paused when she saw William and the military presence. She started to turn away, unsure if she'd come too early, but the younger guard, still watching, raised his hand and waved her through without a word. She nodded in thanks and passed through slowly. Others began to trickle in, not a flood, just ones and twos. A man with an old folded flag under his arm, a woman carrying a single white rose. They approached quietly, saw William standing alone before the third row, and instinctively gave him space. The groundskeepers worked in near silence now. The rattle of carts and bins softened, the conversations quieted. Someone turned off the PA speaker system that had been playing low-volume patriotic music from a CD. No one objected. At 8:55, the chaplain assigned to the Memorial Day ceremony arrived at the north entrance. He wore a long black coat and carried a small satchel of notes, but as he walked the perimeter toward the stage setup, he noticed William standing alone and stopped. He didn't speak, just lowered his head, closed his eyes briefly, and then moved on. At 9 a.m. sharp, the bell from the nearby church struck once, a deep tone rolling over the hills like a wave. William didn't flinch. He simply adjusted his stance and pressed his hand to his jacket pocket again, where the photo remained. This was the watch. Not one assigned, not one written in an operations order, but one taken up voluntarily, year after year, by a man who had once crawled through fire for a friend and now returned through time. His duty wasn't done when the flag was lowered or the speeches ended. His duty was to stand. And remember, he had not saluted again. Not yet. That would come later. At precisely 10, but for now he stood in silence. The kind that speaks louder than any anthem. And behind him, without realizing it, others had begun to take their places too, not because they had to, because something about his stillness told them this was not a morning to sit. It was a morning to watch with him. By 9:20 a.m., the cemetery had filled with a strange stillness, not the kind born of absence, but the kind born of focus. The kind of quiet that descends when something important is happening, and everyone, even if they can't explain why, feels the need to bear witness. A slow procession of early visitors filtered in now, some guided by curiosity, others by instinct. Families came with folded programs tucked under arms, expecting to find rows of chairs and a portable speaker set up. What they found instead was a man standing alone in front of a grave, in full dress uniform, unmoving except for the occasional tightening of the hand on his cane. They paused. They watched, and almost all of them veered wide, giving him a berth as if a boundary had been drawn, not one marked by rope or signage, but by reverence. Children grew quiet near him. Even the toddlers, usually impervious to solemnity, hushed their bouncing and stared wide-eyed at the man in the uniform who looked like he had been carved from the same marble as the headstones. A few rows away, the older security guard stood with his arms crossed, face unreadable. His clipboard now hung at his side like a forgotten relic. He watched William not like a man waiting for a problem to resolve, but like someone who had been unexpectedly pulled into a story still unfolding. Something had changed in him. He no longer saw a policy violation at Gate B. He saw history standing upright on 2 feet and a cane. The younger guard remained posted at the gate. His sunglasses were gone. His radio had fallen silent. Occasionally, he glanced at the entrance as more guests arrived, but his eyes kept returning to William. He hadn't spoken since the black SUVs had come and gone, but his body spoke for him now. Shoulders back, heels together, a slight tilt of the chin. He didn't fully understand what he was witnessing, but he had the sense that years from now, someone might ask where he had been that morning. And he would answer, "I was on post at Gate B." At 9:30, a school bus pulled into the far lot. A high school group, part of a civics program, poured out in scattered lines, adjusting backpacks and jackets, chewing gum and laughing. A teacher pointed toward the ceremony tent, but they didn't get there. They saw the man first. The students stopped, not because they were told to, but because something in the air told them to. A few leaned to whisper questions, but no one answered. Slowly they fanned out and stood still. Not stiff, not performative, just attentive. A boy near the front took off his ball cap and clutched it against his chest. The others followed suit. The teacher, seeing the shift, said nothing. She simply placed a hand over her heart. From where William stood, he didn't turn to look. But he could feel it, that intangible pull. Like back in the jungle, when a sixth sense told you when your unit was ready, when the men behind you had steadied their breath and shouldered their gear. He felt that kind of presence now. The old soldier wasn't alone anymore. They were standing with him, not beside him, not around him, but with him, sharing the weight of that name carved in marble, sharing the decades carried in silence, sharing, even if they didn't understand fully, the cost of promises made in fire and kept in quiet. At 9:40, the wind picked up briefly, fluttering the edges of the American flags lining the main path. One of them perched nearest the front gate, tilted just enough to point straight toward Section 3, Row 5. As if even the flag knew, a presence was being felt, and it was not asking to be honored. It was simply reminding everyone, you are standing on ground that was bought. By 9:45 a.m., protocol had quietly surrendered. There had been no announcement, no directive passed down over radios or printed memos. But anyone who knew anything about structure, about rank, about public coordination, could feel the shift. The Memorial Day program, carefully scheduled to begin at 10 a.m. with a series of introductions, a pledge of allegiance, and a scripted invocation, was quietly stalling. Staff hovered around the podium and speaker cables but didn't dare test the sound system. The chaplain, who had arrived early, remained seated on a bench beneath the oaks with his notes still folded. A trumpet player sat nearby with his instrument resting on his knees, unmoved. It was as if the entire structure of the event had decided to wait on one man's timing. The chairs near the main ceremony tent filled slowly with those who arrived expecting to follow a printed order of events. But their heads kept turning toward the elm tree, toward the 3rd row, 5th stone, and the solitary figure who had not moved except to adjust the pressure on his cane. William Gaines remained exactly where he intended to be. The watch wasn't done. Not yet. Not until the clock struck 10. He was aware of the people behind him. He could hear the occasional cough, the shuffling of shoes, the murmur of parents whispering to children. But he did not turn. He didn't need to. This was Alan's moment. The crowd was not an audience. They were witnesses. Behind the gate, the guards had not returned to their patrols. The younger one stood at attention, not because he was ordered to, but because something inside him insisted he should. The older one leaned against the fence post, arms crossed loosely, his clipboard resting on the bench beside him like something he'd outgrown. At 9:50, a maintenance cart began rolling up the back path toward the speaker tent. carrying two large wreaths wrapped in cloth. As it neared the front rows, the driver slowed, then stopped. The cart didn't move again. The wreaths were not placed. The driver simply stepped out, removed his cap, and stood by the cart with his head lowered slightly. Colonel McBride had long since departed. That was by design. She knew when her presence was useful, and when it wasn't needed. Her role had been to unlock the gate. The rest belonged to the man who had earned this morning with his silence. At 9:55, a sudden hush fell across the crowd. Not prompted, not staged, but real. One by one, people rose from their chairs. Tour groups, teachers, veterans in caps embroidered with gold thread, young parents holding infants, all standing now, not in anticipation of a speech, but in response to the weight of the moment. There were no cameras, no broadcasters, no hashtags, just the sound of wind in the trees, the quiet shifting of shoes on grass, and the long, slow ticking of time as the minute hand crept toward the hour. William stood still, but inside he could feel the breath building in his chest, not grief, not exhaustion, something closer to completion. He reached once more into his jacket and placed his hand over the photograph again. He had carried it through wars, through winters, through years when no one else remembered the name beside his. And now, standing in full view of a crowd that had gathered without invitation, he closed his eyes and whispered almost time. At 9:59, the chaplain rose to his feet, not with a call to prayer, but as a man who knew that the first speech of the day would not be his, because what was about to happen wasn't part of the program. It was the reason the program existed. And Graham, exactly. William Gaines stepped forward. He didn't need a signal. He didn't wait for a cue. The hour had arrived, and with it, the obligation he had carried longer than some of the audience had been alive. He shifted his weight, steadied his grip on the cane, and took the first step forward from the edge of the path toward the grave. The gravel gave a soft crunch under his shoe. The air didn't move. Neither did the crowd. He didn't walk quickly. He didn't limp. He marched, one deliberate step after another, in cadence with a memory that only he could hear. It wasn't the brisk pace of a drill field. It was slower than regulation, but steadier than age. Each step carried its own weight, one for the heat of Quang Tri, one for the smell of jungle rot, one for the sound of rotor blades rising, one for the silence that followed. The path between the crowd and the grave wasn't marked by ropes or painted lines, but people understood to move aside. They parted instinctively, like water around a hull, clearing the way for a man on his last battlefield. Teachers hushed their students. Parents lifted their children slightly higher so they could see better. A small girl in a blue dress clutched an American flag on a stick and held it a little tighter. As William passed, hats came off. Heads bowed. Even those who didn't understand the full story knew they were in the presence of something sacred, not spectacle, sacrifice. The cane tapped once for every 2 steps. Tap, step, step, tap, step, step. He didn't pause. Not to rest, not to adjust. He just kept moving until he reached the exact position, 3 feet from the headstone, facing forward, shoulders squared. The air was still. A slight wind teased the hem of his coat. He took one last breath and shifted his cane to his left side. With his right hand, he removed his cap. He held it against his chest for a moment, then tucked it neatly beneath his arm. And then he stood at attention. For a long, silent beat, nothing happened. Then, slowly, precisely, his right hand rose. It wasn't the stiff, mechanical salute of a new recruit. It was the measured, unwavering gesture of a man who had saluted friends beside body bags, who had stood at too many funerals, some with flags, some without, who had made it home but never left anything behind. His hand reached the brim of his forehead. Fingers together, palm flat, elbow angled sharp. A perfect salute, one that shook no limbs, bowed no back. He held it 1 second, 2, 5 longer. There was no bugle yet. No flag raising, but the gesture itself played louder than any anthem. Then, without flourish, he lowered his hand. He crouched, not fully, but enough to place his palm on the top of the headstone. His fingers touched the cool marble as though it were skin. Not to clean it, not to adjust anything, just to be closer. And then, so quietly only those near the front could hear, he whispered, "I'm still here, Alan, still on time." He didn't rise immediately. He stayed low for another breath, then straightened, slower than before. As he turned away from the grave, the crowd did not applaud. No one moved. No one needed to. This wasn't a performance. It was the closing of a loop. A final march, 55 years in the making, and one step closer to peace. The air shifted as William finished the turn back toward the living. It wasn't loud, no roar, no cheer, but something invisible and immediate moved through the cemetery. A soundless bowing of heads, a pulling in of breath. The breeze arrived almost on cue, rustling through the elm leaves and stirring the edges of flags and jacket hems. It lifted the ends of William's coat and tugged lightly at his cap, tucked beneath his arm, as if to whisper acknowledgement. That salute, long, deliberate, unbroken, had done something to the place. The ground itself seemed quieter, the chatter that had hovered at the edges of the field gone. Even the maintenance cart parked by the wreaths stood idle, its engine turned off, its driver hat still pressed to his chest. William exhaled once, slow and deep, feeling the tremor in his ribs where time and cold had laid their claims. He slid his cap back onto his head, adjusted it until the brim was square, and returned his hand to the cane. The weight of the years felt momentarily lighter, not because anything was finished, but because the promise was kept again. The debt had been paid in the only currency it recognized, presence. Somewhere behind him, a child's small voice broke the hush. "Mom, he's a soldier." The mother shushed gently but didn't scold. The words had the innocent reverence adults struggled to shape. The teacher with the high school group caught William's eye briefly, then looked away with a quick, respectful nod. He began to step back from the grave, and that tiny motion seemed to release the crowd from its held breath. Not into noise, no one clapped or called out, but into a quiet rearranging of stance and gaze. A few veterans in ball caps raised 2 fingers in a subtle salute. One man brushed at his eyes. The students, without instruction, shifted their feet together, mimicking the bearing they'd just witnessed. The wind caught again, stronger this time. It passed over the field like a slow tide, flipping a few flags so their stars flashed bright. It felt almost deliberate, as if Alan himself had found a way to signal back, "Received." William didn't smile, but the corner of his mouth softened. He looked one last time at the headstone, just a glance, brief but full, and then turned to begin the walk back up the slope. His march now was less formal, more human. The hard edges of duty had eased into something gentler. A man leaving a conversation, not a soldier leaving a post. As he passed, the young security guard at the gate straightened sharply and raised his own hand to his brow. An unpracticed salute, but an honest one. William paused, looked at him and nodded once. It was neither permission nor dismissal. It was acknowledgement. The guard lowered his hand slowly, almost shyly. The older guard said nothing but stepped aside, a silent escort letting the veteran pass first. Halfway to the road, the chaplain moved forward at last. He didn't speak. He only touched the brim of his hat and offered a quiet, "God bless you, Sergeant." William answered with a low, "Thank you," and kept walking. The first notes of a bugle floated faintly from the ceremony grounds, not aimed at him but fitting all the same. The national anthem would follow soon, the speeches, the laying of wreaths. But for those who had seen the silent march and salute, the day had already been marked in a different way. The real service had happened quietly and on time. As William reached the open gate, the breeze returned once more, colder now, brushing his cheek and rattling the ivy. He paused just beyond the threshold and looked back, eyes lingering on the row where one stone caught the sun. He raised his hand, not a full salute this time, just a small, almost imperceptible lift of the fingers, the way you might wave across a room to a friend you're leaving but will return to. Then he stepped fully out onto the sidewalk. The mission for this year was done. The wind swept past and carried with it something of both men, one gone for decades, one still keeping watch. And behind the fence, the field of stones stood silent and shining, as if they understood. Long after William stepped through the gate, the hush he left behind lingered like the wake of a ship on still water. The ordinary sounds of the grounds did not return at once. It was as if the cemetery itself refused to resume its schedule until the moment had fully settled. Near the elm, the first to move were the students. A boy with freckles and a ball cap finally exhaled and whispered, "That was real." His teacher only nodded, throat tight, eyes bright. She had brought these kids for a civics lesson. She realized now they'd been given something far heavier than any textbook. One girl slid her phone out, thumb hovering as if to take a picture, but then slowly put it back into her pocket without unlocking it. Some things didn't belong on a screen. The man from the maintenance cart climbed back into his seat, but he didn't start the engine right away. Instead, he removed his own work gloves, set them on the dashboard, and sat quietly for a long minute. Only when another groundskeeper approached and rested a hand on the hood did he nod and finally drive the wreaths forward. But he moved slower than before, almost like a funeral procession. Near the main tent, a few veterans shifted, adjusting caps that read Korea, Iraq, Afghanistan, Desert Storm. They weren't strangers to folded flags or salutes. Still, there was a solemn weight in the way they exchanged glances. One of them murmured, "Old school," and another answered, "The real deal." Then they fell silent again. The younger security guard, still at the entrance, hadn't returned to casual stance. His hand lingered near his brow where he'd raised his first salute minutes ago. He seemed to be replaying what he'd seen, memorizing details he hadn't been taught to notice, the measured pace, the deliberate salute, the photograph never shown, but felt. He was learning something that no training manual included, the kind of respect that isn't about protocol, but about presence. A woman with silver hair who had come early to place flowers on her husband's grave, quietly left her bouquet on Alan Reed's stone instead. She didn't know his story. She only knew what she'd just witnessed deserved flowers. At the stage, the chaplain finally unfolded his notes. He glanced once toward the hill and then back at the assembled crowd. His voice was low but certain when he murmured to the event coordinator, "We'll keep the opening short." They've already had a sermon. The coordinator, usually brisk, simply nodded. Schedules could wait. By 10:15, the usual trappings of Memorial Day resumed. Bugle calls, speeches about service and sacrifice. The national anthem carried faintly on the wind. But something unplanned ran beneath it all, quiet and steady. People who had seen William's march and salute seemed tuned to a different frequency. Conversations stayed softer. Applause, when it came for official speakers, felt respectful rather than routine. Near the back, the young guard finally sat and took out his phone. He didn't film. Instead, he typed a few words into a blank note. SFC William Gaines, look-up story. He wanted to know more, needed to know more. By the time the formal program ended and visitors began filing out, a subtle pattern emerged. Many who had arrived strangers now passed Alan Reed's grave before leaving. Some paused, some touched the stone. Some whispered thanks to no one visible. Witnesses had gathered because of one man's quiet insistence to stand and keep a promise. And those witnesses would carry the story with them to classrooms, dinner tables, text messages, and long drives home. It would not stay contained inside the fence. In that way, William's march was still happening, rippling outward. Each new step was being taken now by others, carrying the memory forward without asking permission. And somewhere beyond the gate, the man himself kept walking, cane tapping pavement, shoulders square. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. The watch had passed into other hands. After the ceremony ended and the crowds began to drift back toward the parking lots, a cemetery groundskeeper named Robert stayed behind with his cart. He was in his 50s, broad-shouldered, sunburnt at the neck, and used to quiet work. He'd noticed the old soldier early that morning and had paused, moved but unsure what to do. Now, with the chairs half stacked and the trumpets packed away, Robert felt an odd tug, unfinished business. He steered his small cart back toward Section 3 under the wide sky, tires whispering over the grass. When he reached Alan Reed's grave, he turned the engine off and stepped down. The air smelled of cut grass and distant barbecue smoke, but here it was clean, cool, untouched. The headstone gleamed faintly. At its base, weighted under a smooth river rock, was the folded paper William had left. Robert hesitated before reaching for it. He wasn't the type to pry, but something about the care with which the old man had tucked it down said, "Find me when I'm ready to be found." He lifted the rock gently, took the letter, and sat on the cart's edge. The envelope was worn but sealed with a single, careful strip of tape. On the front, in precise block letters, "For who finds this, please remember." Robert sat a long moment. Then, almost ceremonially, he peeled the tape and opened the flap. The letter was written on lined paper, the kind from a school notebook. The handwriting was steady but heavy, each letter deliberate. He began to read. "This is not just a grave. It's a date kept. A brother remembered. We said we'd salute each other till the end. One of us made it home. One of us held the line. That's why I'm here." Robert swallowed hard and read on. "If you've found this, it means I've kept my word another year. Maybe I couldn't speak to the crowd. Maybe there was no crowd. That doesn't matter. What matters is someone sees that promises don't break just because time tries to wear them down. We were boys when we swore it. We were scared and loud and thought we'd live forever. We didn't, but some things last if you choose to make them last." Robert let the paper rest in his lap for a long moment. He wasn't a soldier. He'd been a mechanic most of his life before coming to work grounds here. But the words pulled something deep and human in him, the way bonds outlive the men who forged them. He looked around. The cemetery was nearly empty now. A couple lingered far off among other stones, but otherwise the field was silent, sun breaking through in patches. Robert reached down, smoothed the grass around the base of the headstone, and placed the letter back under the rock, careful to fold the flap the way it had been. As he started the cart again, he paused and looked down the slope to where William had walked hours before. He wondered how many times the man had left notes like this, little anchors of memory tucked away against the erosion of years. He wondered how long the sergeant would be able to come. Robert made a small decision right there. Next Memorial Day, he would check this grave early. He'd make sure the path was clear, the stone washed, the gate open. No veteran who came for a friend should ever find a lock in his way. The cart rolled off slowly, engine humming low. The letter stayed behind, safe under its smooth stone. Words pressed into silence, but alive now in another witness. Somewhere on the road back to town, William was likely already homeward bound, unaware that his private note had been read, but perhaps that was part of the plan. Memory, like service, works best when it moves quietly into other hands. Private First Class. Jordan Mills could not shake what he'd seen that morning. He was 22, assigned to Colonel McBride's liaison team for Memorial Day logistics. His first time working outside the barracks. His first time wearing the Army's dress blues in an official capacity. The detail had been simple on paper. Assist VIPs, help local security, and represent the old guard if anything ceremonial came up. He had expected flags, speeches, the usual scripted solemnity. He had not expected Sergeant First Class William Gaines. When the call came through Colonel McBride's line and orders filtered down, escort a retired sergeant to a gravesite, Jordan had assumed routine. But the moment the black SUVs pulled up and he stepped out behind the colonel, something shifted. The man waiting at the gate wasn't simply a veteran asking entry. He was a presence, a fixed point. Jordan remembered how William stood, how his eyes locked on one distant stone, how the whole place seemed to pivot around that quiet resolve. Now, hours later, the formal ceremony long done. Jordan still lingered in the lot as others packed up chairs and loaded equipment. He leaned against the SUV and replayed the march, the slow, deliberate crossing of the field. The salute held longer than regulation. The letter tucked under stone. He thought about how nothing about it had been for show, how the man hadn't asked for music or recognition. He had just come to keep a promise. Jordan thought of his own reasons for enlisting. He had joined half on impulse, half on legacy. His grandfather had served in Korea, but he died when Jordan was small. Military life so far had been paperwork, training ranges, long days of chores disguised as duties. He'd worn the uniform, but hadn't yet felt its weight. Today he had. He opened his phone and started typing notes before the details dulled. Sergeant First Class William Gaines, Vietnam, grave of Corporal Alan Reed, promise kept. Gate closed but opened because chain of command still matters when it's about respect. He stopped and backspaced the last phrase, then rewrote it slower. Respect is not a favor. It's a debt. Jordan didn't know what he would do with these words, maybe just keep them, but something inside felt changed. He'd seen dozens of ceremonies built to look like remembrance. He'd just witnessed remembrance without ceremony. Colonel McBride came by on her way to the driver's seat, pausing when she saw him there. "You all right, Mills?" "Yes, ma'am," he hesitated. "Permission to speak freely?" She gave the faintest smile. "Always. That man, Gaines. That's the army I want to belong to," Jordan said quietly. "The one that shows up, the one that doesn't need permission to remember." McBride regarded him for a long moment, eyes narrowing not in reprimand, but in the way experienced leaders study something forming. "Then carry it," she said. "What you saw is the job, maybe the hardest part. Making sure promises outlive the men who made them." He nodded, throat tight. She gave his shoulder a brief squeeze before moving on. "Get in, Private." "We're wheels up." Jordan climbed into the back seat, still looking once more towards Section 3 as the SUV pulled away. The sun caught Alan Reed's stone in a quick flash of white. For a second, Jordan imagined the two young men in that faded photograph, mud-smeared, laughing, alive. He pictured the pact, "If you go first." As the cemetery disappeared behind them, Jordan made an unspoken decision. Someday, when his own service was long done, he would come back to this place. He would tell new soldiers about a man who didn't let gates or time break a bond. He would remember the way the world stilled to let one veteran march, and somewhere, in that quiet commitment, a small transfer happened. The watch moved forward another step. William's truck was not new. A silver pickup with a cracked dashboard and the faint smell of oil. It sat waiting in the visitor lot like an old horse that knew its way home. He moved slowly but steadily toward it, cane tapping, uniform coat folded across his arm now that the air had warmed. There was no crowd escorting him out, no speeches trailing after him. Only the faint rustle of flags and the muted conversations of families resuming their plans. That was exactly how he wanted it. Quiet, unannounced. He had not come to be a symbol. He had come to keep faith. The younger guard stood near the exit gate, hat still in his hands. When William reached him, he spoke, voice tentative but respectful. "Sir." William paused, looked at him with eyes clear but weary. "Thank you," the guard said simply. He didn't add for what. The words seemed enough. William gave a short nod. "Take care of them," he said, gesturing lightly back toward the rows of stones. The guard swallowed and nodded once. At the far end of the lot, a woman with the small boy, the one in the blue dress shirt, paused beside her car as William passed. She lifted a hand. "Thank you for your service," she said softly. He answered with the faintest half-smile, but didn't break stride. There was no need to turn this into a conversation. What needed saying had already been said at the grave. As he reached his truck, he eased the cane against the bumper and unlocked the door. The simple act of pulling himself into the driver's seat took a little more effort than it used to, but he didn't mind. Pain was part of living. What mattered was movement. Before starting the engine, he sat for a moment. The cemetery stretched in his side mirror, white rose gleaming in a growing sun. He thought briefly of the letter he'd left, unsure who might read it or when, but comforted knowing it was there, a breadcrumb for whoever cared enough to look closer. He glanced at the passenger seat where a small cloth bag sat. Extra medals polished and repinned, spare gloves, a clean flag folded with care. He carried these things every year, though rarely used them. Ritual had its own kind of strength. His phone buzzed once in his pocket, an unfamiliar number. He answered because old habits die hard. Sergeant Gaines? The voice was young, respectful. Yes, this is Private Mills from the liaison detail. I just wanted to say, I saw you today. It mattered. William closed his eyes briefly. Then remember what you saw, son. I will, sir. The line clicked off. William looked at the phone, faintly puzzled, but quietly pleased. Another small transfer of memory, unplanned but real. He started the engine. The pickup coughed once, then settled into its low, familiar rumble. As he drove slowly down the lane toward the exit, he passed a few lingering families. Some waved quietly. Some simply stepped aside, heads dipping unconsciously in the way one might when a flag goes by. No grand send-off. No applause. Only space given and small gestures made. That was enough. He turned onto the main road, the cemetery shrinking behind him until the rows of white blurred into the tree line. His mission for the day was complete, but his ledger felt heavier in a good way. Another year kept, another salute given. Another promise held fast against time's erosion. He reached over and touched the edge of the photograph tucked under the sun visor. Just for a second. Another year, buddy, he murmured. Still on time. Then he faced forward, eyes clear on the long road home, content with the quiet exit that fit the life he'd lived. Service without fanfare, love without announcement, and a duty that didn't end at the cemetery gate. The folded letter William had left behind did not stay secret for long. By mid-afternoon, after the last cars had rolled away and the sound of folding chairs being stacked echoed faintly across the lawn, Robert the groundskeeper returned to Alan Reed's stone with a second man in tow. This one wore khaki and a camera bag slung across his shoulder. The local newspaper photographer who'd been asked to get a few color shots of the Memorial Day service. Robert had stopped him with a quiet word. There's something you should see. The photographer knelt, adjusted the strap of his camera, and brushed grass clippings from the marble. Then Robert lifted the smooth stone that held the letter and passed it over like a sacred object. Read it, Robert said. The photographer hesitated. Are we supposed to? It says for who finds this, Robert replied. And I found it. They unfolded the pages with care, the paper soft from being handled but not fragile. The handwriting leaned slightly right, each word deliberate, firm but not ornate. The photographer read aloud, voice low, This is not just a grave. It's a date kept. A brother remembered. We said we'd salute each other till the end. One of us made it home. One of us held the line. That's why I'm here. He paused, throat catching unexpectedly. Robert motioned for him to go on. If you found this, it means another year's promise is kept. Maybe no one else came. That's fine. Not all debts are public. Some belong only to two people, one living, one gone. But if your eyes found these words, then at least for a moment, three of us stand here together. Tell somebody, if you can, that not every salute is seen on a screen. Tell them some of us just show up because we said we would. They stood there a while in silence. The photographer lowered the page slowly and pressed his palm to the stone, as if answering the quiet request. Robert folded the letter again, but more gently this time, and replaced it under the smooth rock. You going to write about him? Robert asked. The photographer thought for a long moment. Maybe not a whole article, he said. Not without asking him. But I can put one picture in the paper. The grave. The letter? No names, Robert nodded. Fair. They worked quietly for a few more minutes, Robert raking, the photographer capturing soft frames of flags and sunlight. When the younger man left, Robert lingered. He touched the rock again before climbing onto his cart. That evening, the photographer posted a single photo online. It wasn't splashy, just a close-up of Alan Reed's stone. The edge of the folded letter visible, a cane tip faintly out of focus in the background. The caption read, A promise kept. Maple Ridge Veterans Cemetery, May 30th. By nightfall, the image had been shared hundreds of times. Veterans groups recognized the power without needing names. Teachers saw something to show their classes next year. Strangers wrote small comments. "Thank you for keeping watch. This is how we remember." One of us held the line. William didn't know. He was home by then, uniform hung carefully. Kane leaned by the door. He sat at his kitchen table with a mug of coffee, cooling slowly, the weight of the day settling into a quiet ache and an even quieter satisfaction. The world might catch pieces of his ritual, but that wasn't why he wrote. The letter was never about going viral. It was about leaving a trace sturdy enough to outlast him, so if someday his own legs or lungs failed, the story could walk without him, in that small house miles away. He tapped the table once, almost like the cane on pavement, and whispered, "They found it, Alan. Someone always will." The quiet ripple from William's visit did not fade with the setting sun. It traveled instead, through small conversations first, and then through channels that policies usually travel. Informal, hesitant, but steady. Robert, the groundskeeper, spoke to his supervisor the next morning while checking irrigation valves. He didn't ask permission. He simply said, "We locked the gate on a man who had been coming here for 50 years. That can't happen again." The supervisor listened, uncomfortable, because he'd seen the letter too. "Policy's policy," he said weakly, but his voice lacked conviction. Robert pressed once more. "Policy exists to protect the grounds, not to keep promises from being kept." By that afternoon, an email chain began inside the small office that oversaw Maple Ridge Veterans Cemetery. Subject line, "Gate access for legacy visitors." The words weren't dramatic, but they moved. One staffer added a note. "We've had recurring complaints about Memorial Day lockouts. Recommend considering a small exception for verified veteran visits." Another replied, "Yesterday was instructive. It was wrong to block that man. Maybe there's a better way." Within a week, the note reached the State Veterans Affairs liaison, who had already seen the viral photograph. She forwarded it upward with a single line. "This is the kind of mistake that turns sacred ground into bureaucracy." Meetings followed. Quiet, untelevised, but not perfunctory. Someone printed the letter William left and slid it across a conference table as evidence. "This," one official said, "is what we claim to honor. If we can't make room for this, what are we doing?" Heads nodded. No one wanted to be the person arguing against basic decency. The change, when it came, was simple. A single paragraph was added to the cemetery's visitor rules and quietly approved by the regional office. Veteran legacy access. Veterans seeking to visit the grave of a comrade in arms may request early or after-hours entry for purposes of remembrance or promise fulfillment. Verification of service and grave location required. Staff discretion authorized. It wasn't splashy, but it was real. It gave the on-duty guard a reason to open a gate without fear of reprimand. It gave men like William a path through paper walls. Robert printed the updated policy and taped it behind the guard station desk with a fresh heading in black marker, "Honor before hours." The younger guard, his name was Daniel, stood reading it the first morning it appeared. He felt something settle in him, relief, pride, and a quiet vow to never again make an old soldier wait. Elsewhere, the photograph of Alan Reed's grave with the edge of the letter kept circulating. It reached a military family network group, then veteran support nonprofits. By summer, it was quietly referenced in training slides for new cemetery. Personnel, a single picture, no names, captioned, "Let them in." William did not know this yet. He did not seek it. But unseen, the chain of small decisions sparked by his quiet insistence was shaping a new courtesy. A courtesy that understood memory isn't just ceremonial. It's lived. That September, Colonel McBride emailed him a short note. She kept it sparse, the way soldiers do. "Sergeant Gaines, policy at Maple Ridge, amended. Veteran legacy access approved. Thought you should know." McBride William read it twice. Then he set the phone down and stared out his kitchen window at the quiet Ohio road. Leaves were just starting to turn. After a long pause, he chuckled softly, one low sound, equal parts satisfaction and disbelief. He didn't reply. Some things didn't need reply. He rose slowly, walked to the mantel, and touched the photo of two muddy boys again. "Doors open now," he murmured. "No more locked gates, Alan." And with that, a promise widened just a little, enough for others to walk through. Morning light slid across the kitchen table in William Gaines's small Ohio home. The uniform he'd worn the day before hung from a simple wooden hanger on the back of a chair. Medals gleaming quietly in the slanting sun, coat shoulders square as if waiting for next year. His cane leaned nearby, mud still clinging to its tip from the damp ground around Alan's grave. On the table lay his small leather-bound journal, its corners worn smooth from decades of use. William sat slowly, a mug of coffee steaming between his palms. He opened the journal to a fresh page and wrote the date at the top, May 30th. His handwriting was blocky but careful, the script of a man who had filled many field reports long ago and never lost the habit of precision. Under the date he wrote a single line, "Promise fulfilled." He paused, tapped the pen twice against the paper and added, "Gate locked at first but opened." Alan remembered. Another year done. He didn't write more. He never did on these entries. They were meant to be a log, not a story. He closed the book and placed it back in its spot on the shelf beside a framed photo of two young soldiers in jungle mud, their arms slung around each other, teeth flashing in defiance of the camera. His gaze lingered on that photograph until the coffee cooled. The house was quiet. Outside, the low hum of a passing truck rattled the window pane. Somewhere down the street, kids shouted faintly, riding bicycles in the first heat of summer break. William smiled faintly. The sound of ordinary life was always a kind of benediction. His phone buzzed once on the table. A text from an unknown number. "Sir, this is Daniel, the young guard from yesterday. Just wanted to say I won't forget. Thank you for showing me what this uniform means." William read it twice, then typed a short reply, "Take care of the watch, son." He hit send and set the phone aside. He rose with deliberate care and went to the closet where his service flag was folded on the top shelf. He pulled it down, laid it across the bed, and smoothed the fabric. He did this once a year after his visit, not from superstition but because it anchored him, a reminder of where he had come from and where he was going. As he worked, his eyes caught the small manila envelope tucked between the flag's folds, next year's letter. Blank now, but ready. He would write it when the time came, if the time came. His body wasn't what it used to be. He knew that. But as long as breath remained, so would the pilgrimage. He returned to the kitchen and glanced at the window, the road stretching east toward the cemetery miles away. Somewhere beyond that horizon was the field of white, and Alan's stone among them. William closed his eyes and pictured it, the elm tree, the smooth rock, the folded note waiting to be discovered again, or perhaps to rest untouched if no one needed it. "Next year," he said softly, voice carrying both hope and realism, "I'll be early." He chuckled once at the thought, the sound warm and self-deprecating. Then he reached for the mug, finished his now cold coffee, and let the house fall back into silence. No fanfare, no medals needed polishing today, just the knowledge that another year's duty was done. A gate once closed had opened, a promise had lived one more time. And if this year happened to be his last journey to Alan's side, that too would be all right. He had done what he swore as a young man in a jungle far away. Outside, the breeze picked up, touching the curtains. William looked toward the sound, imagining for just a heartbeat that it carried a voice. Laughing, teasing, grateful. He smiled and whispered back, "Still here, buddy." Then he turned to face the day, lighter for having kept the watch once more.